everyone. Welcome to Podcast Book Talks. I'm Sydney.
And I'm Francisco.
And today on Podcast Book Talks, we will be talking about the remarkable story of I Am Malala, written about and by Malala Yousafzai.
I Am Malala is told in first-person point of view by Malala herself. It is 288 pages long and is grouped in the categories biography and autobiography.
Okay, so the story of I Am Malala is an autobiography following the life of a young Pakistani girl growing up in the Swat Valley, which is a region of Pakistan. Malala highlights her experiences growing up as a young woman in the Middle East. She really loved her family. She was smart, valued her education. She loved going to school, and she also mentions a lot how she loved hanging out with her friends. The book follows her young life up until the point she was targeted by the Taliban terrorist group on the way to school, where she was shot in the head and sustained life-threatening injuries. The book goes through her growing up with her father and mother, along with her two younger siblings, who were different than most Pakistani parents. Her father believed in women's rights, which was not something many Pakistani or Muslim men believed in at the time. This was in the early 2000s. And her father was a local social activist who built schools for young girls and boys throughout the Swat Valley, which really played a big part in Malala's love for education growing up. And more importantly, the right to an education for young girls. Growing up, more and more dangerous conflicts in Pakistan and the Swat Valley kept arising, and a terrorist group named the Taliban began killing innocent civilians and women and civilians, more specifically in favor of women's rights, and who spoke out publicly against it. As Malala's love for advocating women's education grew, she regularly gave speeches to the public regarding these issues and was interviewed a lot. The Taliban became more and more violent, killing more people and women every day.
Eventually, Malala and her family were forced to move away from the Swat Valley, weeks or months at a time. One day, when Malala was on the way to school, she was shot by men in the Taliban. She survives, but is quickly taken to England for more advanced and modern medical care. Here the book concludes as she begins her new and different life in school and in a much different country than Pakistan.
So, in terms of the story, we wanted to propose some possible questions or some questions that arose in our minds during and after reading the book. We ask you, the listeners, and as well we ask ourselves, how would you feel if your right to an education was taken away from you? How did the descriptions of the living conditions of many people in a third world country such as Pakistan make you feel? Do you feel grateful for the things that you have here? If you could, how would you choose to fight oppressions and discriminations in your home country?
Also, how difficult would you find it to be if one day you were forced out of your home? How difficult would you find it to be if one day you were forced out of your home country? How is Malala admirable, and how can her story impact and inspire young women just like her? After reading this book, I would definitely recommend it to everyone, not just young people, but people of all ages. More specifically, I think young women would find this book most beneficial to read.
Yes, I definitely agree with that. As a young woman myself, I found it extremely shocking as well as disheartening to hear through the book that something I'm guaranteed the right to every day, which is my education, is something so many young girls and women are denied on a daily basis.
Definitely. I know the situation in terms of education in Pakistan are still changing. However, I hope one day that boys and girls all around the globe will have the opportunity to attain an education without being persecuted because of their gender. This is definitely a book everyone should read at least once in their lives, so they can get some perspective into some things they may not know are happening in other parts of the world.
So, just to rate the book, on a scale from 1 to 5 stars, I would rate this book a 4.5 stars. There are some parts of the book where it is somewhat easy to get lost, but other than that, I really, really love this book. The writing, description, detail, and retelling is nothing short of amazing.
And for me, on a scale of 1 to 5 stars, I would rate this book 5 stars. As I mentioned earlier, I found it extremely inspiring as well as motivational. Please, if you have not yet, go read this book. Before we end the podcast, we just wanted to talk a little about Malala today and how she has used what happened to her and what she experienced in order to help and speak out for a young woman just like herself. At just 17 years old, A few years after she was shot, she became the youngest Nobel Prize winner in history. She also, at the age of 16, addressed the United Nations in New York City, discussing what had happened to her, as well as education rights.
Additionally, Malala has since started the Malala Foundation, or the Malala Fund, which has given many adolescent girls the opportunity to be educated in many third world developing countries where almost all the young girls there do not attend school. Okay, everyone, thank you so much for listening to Podcast Book Talks.
It was great getting to discuss and read I Am Malala. I really enjoyed this book.
Me too. I remember reading this book in 7th grade, but I barely remember anything from it. I am glad I was able to read it again and really know more about the topics at hand that Malala discusses in the book.
Again, this is Francisco Zapata
and Sydney Hayes
saying goodbye.